Anyway, so I was saying actually that today I am joined by four of the six co-editors. So I'm one of them to the volume. And before I introduce them, I think it's important to note that we are not only editors, but also contributors. We all wrote at least one chapter. Actually, the co-editor that wrote two chapters, she couldn't make it today. She's very busy, but she's missed very much Marie, and we're thinking of her for sure. So I'm saying this because we all have some country expertise, and so we will also welcome country-specific questions later on. So I'm going to start with Veronique Dudouet. Veronique is a senior advisor at the Conflict Transformation Research Department at Berghof Foundation. And she was, most importantly, maybe the coordinator of the EU Horizon 2020 research project PAVE between 2020 and 2023. Actually, not too far from her, in the room next door, we have Johanna Hülzer. She also works with the Berghof Foundation in Berlin. She works also in the Conflict Transformation Research Department, and she was a very important part of the coordination team of the PAVE project during those 3 years. And I should say that Veronique and Johanna were really our guides through the storm of this project. And we're not only conducting the research in quite difficult fields, but also during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it was very stormy at times, and we're very lucky to have them. The next co-editor I want to introduce is Maja Halilovic. Maja, I'm so sorry if I butchered your name, hopefully not too much. She's a research fellow at the School of Religion at Trinity College Dublin, and she teaches on fantastic subjects such as the sociology of conflict, race, ethnicity, identity, and she's also a fantastic teacher. And Maja is also a radicalization expert for the Western Balkans as part of the Radicalization Awareness Network. And I do remember every time we would meet, and wherever we would meet, Maja always had fantastic recommendations of places to visit, from Turkish bath to restaurants. So she's not only a radicalization expert, but she's also the foodie or the travel expert of the group. And last but certainly not least, we are also joined by Amjed Rasheed. Amjed is jumping from one institution to another, but currently is a lecturer of defense studies at the Department of Security Studies at King's College London. He's also a senior researcher at Open Think Tank in Kurdistan, and he does specialize in international relations, peace and conflict studies, and political Islam. And beyond Iraq, you have to know that Amjed is kind of the Wikipedia of the Middle East. In our group, it would provide you with very honest perspectives on the region. So any questions on the region should be directed at him. Right, so very quickly, so we will have a very short introduction to the PAVE project that gave birth to this volume. We will then hear about each of the co-editors that are with us today, about the three main sections of the book. I will then ask the co-editors to share their key takeaway for the project, and we will then open for Q&As. If everything runs smoothly, and I'm sure it will, we will have at least half an hour for questions and answers. So this is a classic Zoom meeting. So if you want to ask a question, feel free to either type it in the chat, or later on when we open the floor to everyone, you can also unmute yourself and ask questions directly. And as I can see, we do have a few contributors to the volume in the chat, so they might be able to jump in at some point and to share some of their reflections. Right, so I think we are ready to start. I am going to, oh, all right. Vero, I'm going to give you the floor for about, yes, 10 minutes or so. And yes, thank you again to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Juline. Thank you so much for organizing this. And it's great to be reunited for the presentation of this joint book indeed. And as you said, I'm very happy that there's a few more contributors who are in the call, so we can also have their inputs on specific country findings. So as Juline was explaining, this book that we are very happy to present today was part of a project called PAVE, Preventing and Addressing Violent Extremism in the Western Balkans and in the MENA region, which was a EU-funded 3-year project under the Horizon 2020 framework. And so this project had a number of I think 13 partner organizations engaged together into this embarking on this project. So some of us are based within the EU, or okay, formerly EU, looking at Juline in the UK, but also in the Western Balkans and in the MENA region, so both North Africa and Middle East. And so the overall focus of the project, and therefore also on the book, was in taking what we called a meso-level approach to looking at the factors of community vulnerability and community resilience to violent extremism. And so looking at factors and dynamics within communities, between communities, and between state and society. So taking that meso-level approach also didn't mean that we didn't take the other levels seriously. So we were also interested in looking at structural factors and the role of the state, as we'd be hearing in one of the sections of the book, focusing on the role of the state, but also taking into account more micro-level approaches to individual trajectories and push and pull factors, as these are called in the de-radicalization and TVE literature. So the data was collected in 7 countries that are also presented in the book. So Kosovo, North Macedonia, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Lebanon, Iraq, and Tunisia. And the data was primarily collected through qualitative means, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, content analysis. We also had other methods in the project, but they are not really reflected in the book. So the book is mainly based on our qualitative work. The teams were very much multidisciplinary. So I think some of us are political scientists or IR or security studies or peace and conflict studies specialists. But we also had sociologists, which was great. Some also that are versed into social psychology and religious studies. On the slide that Juline shows, there's a portrayal of the 4 thematic areas that we looked at in the projects that I think are also reflected in the book. That takes an actor-oriented approach. So why did we decide to focus or to embark on this book? So, well, I think for us, one major reason was to allow us to disseminate some key findings to a wider academic audience and student audience than what EU projects allow for. So in these EU projects, we have typically what's called deliverables, and many of them being public, being found on our website. But having a book is always a really nice way of enabling a discussion and with the academic community. We are, of course, very grateful to the Routledge series on countering violent extremism, which is led by Dr. Daniel Koller, for giving us this opportunity. So we decided to focus the book on an actor-centric approach because we felt in our research, I think that was confirmed by the data collection and analysis, that vulnerability and resilience are very much agency-based processes where community leaders, among others, play an active role. So what we mean by community is individuals and social groups that share a common sense of belonging, either due to their geographic proximity, for instance, a municipality, or based on shared characteristics between them. So in this approach to communities, we put a lot of emphasis on community leaders that are identified through their abilities to influence the beliefs, the discourses, the actions, and the social interactions among their peers. Those leaders are perceived by community members as having authority, having trust, having a certain degree of legitimacy and influence over members. Community leaders, as we identified them in the project and in the book, come in various forms and shapes. So this includes state representatives at the national, but also at the local level, so elected officials, civil servants, police officers, and so forth, but also religious, formal and informal religious leaders, traditional leaders, and civil society leaders, from NGOs to media, women's group, youth groups, educators, and others involved in culture, art, sports, etc. So a really, I would say, inclusive approach to civil society. And yeah, we'll share more about that later on. So what we think is that those leaders, by their actions or by their inactions, they have a lot of responsibility, I would say, and influence over the community's readiness and ability to resist the appeal of extremist groups and ideologies in the face of structural challenges such as polarization, economic disparity, political exclusion, war legacies, and unfinished state building projects in most of the countries that we looked at. There's complex web of interrelations between those actors. And we were also very interested in looking at the degree of cooperation, coordination between them, or the rivalry, antagonism, or co-optation between them. So these are some of the dynamics that we wanted to explore in the book. And as we'll hear, we also looked at what we called, and as what you can see here reflected in one of the thematic areas, kind of what we call cumulative extremisms, looking at the interface between religious, sectarian, ethno-political expressions of violent extremism and the legacies of violence. And I think Maja will probably, and others will go into that. We were very interested in exploring what resilience means, and we are aware that it's become a buzzword in the PECV community. It has been criticized by many for being maybe depoliticizing, disempowering, or focusing on how individuals have to cope with situations and not looking at the structural maybe drivers of violent extremism. But we wanted to reclaim that term and to give it some sense of focus around the capacity of communities to prevent or react to the threat of violent extremism and to resist its root causes and manifestations. As we'll be hearing from the contributors, we also found that, of course, resilience is not inherently positive, and different forms of resilience can interact and maybe compete and contradict each other. So what else should I say? Maybe just to finish on the comparative perspective, the fact that the book looks at two regions of the European neighborhood that are rarely studied together. So the Western Balkans on the one hand and the MENA region on the other hand. They share lots of common patterns of radicalization, de-radicalization, and violent extremism, even though they have very distinct historical, political, and cultural trajectories. And I'm happy to go more into that in the discussion time. Maybe just to finish on the structure of the book, I think you have a couple of slides on that, Juline. So, well, before the part one, we have kind of like an introduction and then a more theoretical chapter that looks at the key terms and maybe the theoretical trends in research around PCVE. And then we have three main parts. So the first part on state actors has like focused case study chapters looking at Serbia, Iraq, and Lebanon. Then the second part looks at religious actors and again has kind of single country focused chapters, one on Bosnia-Herzegovina, one on Lebanon, and one on Tunisia. And then finally, the third part looks at civil society actors, including the media in Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Lebanon. And then yeah, we have a conclusion where we try to bring together the different findings and also implications for policy. And I'm happy to go back to those conclusions later on, but I really want to now stop and let Juline continue the moderation to look at those three sets of actors in detail.
Thank you very much, Vero. It's very challenging, I guess, to summarize such a big project in barely 10 minutes, but you did fantastically well. So thank you very much for this. And yes, there will be much more time to expand a little bit on all the aspects of the project and the key findings. All right, so I would like us to start with the first part of the book that focuses on state actors. And I will give the floor to the co-editor that actually brilliantly managed this section. So Maja, you have about 10 minutes. To basically tell us all about those three fantastic chapters. And I'm not saying this because I'm one of the contributors, of course. So yes, the floor is yours, Maja.
Thank you. Can I share screen?
Yeah. Let me just stop sharing mine. And
can you see this?
Yes, we can see it. Fantastic.
Let me just move a sound. And you can hear me properly. So Thank you first, Juline, for organizing this event. And thank you, Vero, also, and Johanna, for getting us through the hurdle of putting the book together, because it was a beautiful but also challenging project, because we had so much findings and our data was so rich. So it was really beautiful that we actually managed to find an angle where we can actually talk about all this richness. I think from perspective, from theoretical perspective, and I'll just have one slide on that first, it was important. One of our key findings was that mechanisms that operate or have operated up to date in relation to countering violent extremism were, so to speak, Eurocentric, in some way Westrocentric. They, due to the fact that the field is relatively new. If you think about it, it's only over 2 decades old. And it was developed by dealing to the responses that were mainly happening in Europe and in Western world. So what we found is that this is not how the model operates in post-conflict societies. And when I say post-conflict societies, that's another part that can be debated, but we can talk about that in a question and answer session. Post-conflict, pre-conflict, conflict, etc. societies. So what is happening there? It's very different to some kind of a straightforward model of counter-violent extremism in other contexts. So this directly relates to the legacy, as Vero mentioned, of conflict. So we put together a new model, conflict to radicalization and violent extremism trajectory, where we discovered that in response to the legacies of conflict that are still bubbling in a season, new different form of violent extremisms are developing, such as ethnopolitical, ethno-religious, sectarian, different variations of it. And so this relates to the fact that in most places, most contexts that we work in, there hasn't been failed reconciliation this way or another. Those societies are polarized, they're divided, and they're fertile ground for many dysfunctionalities that then lead to radicalization and violent extremism. They're different in different contexts, but the trajectory is present in all of the regions that we were working in. So on a kind of more, on a bigger or rather higher level, we have not only discovered and created this model, but we have also, and we're still working on it, to connect peace and conflict studies and radicalization and violent extremism field, because they are not talking to each other properly. And one of our recommendations by producing this book is that they should be more learning between those two. And as Vero mentioned, our work slightly challenges the work that has been so far. So it's innovative in that sense as well, that it's a community level and it looks at a collective, not just individual radicalization and violent extremism. So it looked into whether it's in relation to vulnerability when we had the vulnerability, and what is the other one? Resilience, yes. Whether it's in relation to one another, but it's on the community level. So in some sense, you know, we are with this book and our work and a project moving the field forward. And this is related to the section of the book very much that talks about the role of state structures, precisely because these societies are post-conflict. The legacy of violence is still very much alive. States that are operating there are part of the problem often, rather than part of the solution. European Western model would see state as a part of the solution. mechanisms are delivered, templates are delivered, recommendations are delivered to the state agents who then implement it on the ground, and that's how we're doing that's how we're countering violent extremism. In these areas, it's very different. In many different ways, they are part of the problems. The democracies, as such, there are often ethnocracies, and Juline and Amjed and me had a very interesting conversation in relation to that, in relation to Iraq, where the place would often be seen as a place that it's a fragile state. And it was quite the opposite. It was very robust and capable of keeping the status quo. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, the ethnic divisions have been institutionalized and constitutionalized. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to get the chapter for that part of the section at the time due to other responsibilities, but it's a very dysfunctional state. And the whole area, it kind of operates differently. So I think I'm aware of my time. It is important that we just take into account that states as an actor, it's much more complicated in those areas than in other parts of the world. So I leave it there.
Oh, thank you, Maja. You were actually incredibly efficient. You still have 2-3 minutes if you wish. That's unusual, but I really appreciate that.
Sorry, I was trying to keep on track on time, so maybe I have missed.
No,
anyway, we can discuss this. It's a huge theoretical area and maybe much more fruitful if you do it during the session.
Yes,
yeah.
and I think you gave us a lot of food for thought, so hopefully it will also encourage a lot of questions to be asked after that. All right, so then let's move to the next section of the book on religious actors. And Amjed will be the one to present those 3 great chapters. Amjed, do you have a slides presentation?
No, I don't.
You don't? Okay, no problem at all. Then I will give you the floor for about 10 minutes, and I will just display the 3 chapters that are part of this section. Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juline, for the generous introduction and also for organizing this. I would also have to thank Alice for her incredible work to put all this together and organize this. It's always lovely to see those faces. And as I said, you know, I've before going live, I miss those faces. I would really like to work with you guys at some point in the future. So it's always great to be part of any talk or initiatives that you are, you know, that help us basically to unite. Just to recap. Not to recap, but to basically focus specifically on the religious actors and without really wasting time. This part of the book really questioned the idea of the widespread idea of you know, the fact that, you know, violent extremism or extremism in general is solely tied to religion, or looking at it from the traditional schools of thought that is inherently ideological, right? And those those chapters did not really speak of the instrumental aspect of schools of thought, where basically looks at religion or ideology in general as a source of power, but somehow, you know, tackle this issue without really explicitly talking about it. The 3 chapters emphasize the importance of including religious figures, formal and informal, in counter-violent extremism effort. The formal religious institutions and figures are basically the ones that are part of the state, and the informal religious institutions and figures are basically the ones that are not part of the state, right? So more specifically, to go to the chapters, the finding, at least from the chapter on Bosnia and Herzegovina, highlights the importance of the formal or the state linked religious institutions. But there was also some hesitations in recognizing their positive contributions. The authors argue that those religious institutions have, in fact, dual role. First one is positive, and I quote, through outreach of the masses, knowledge sharing, guidance, counseling, dialogue, transparency, and the development of local partnership. But they also have a negative role, and I quote, through lack of cooperation with communities, isolation, non-recognition of the problem within their own institutions, and non-profit cooperation. Moreover, the chapter finds out that actually inside those religious bodies, the state-led religious bodies, there is an acknowledgement of change. But because now those religious institutions are actually connected to the politics or the political settings or the power configurations within the country, it creates rather complex issues due to this balance between ethnicity and religion in the country, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And something similar to the case of Lebanon, which I'm going to speak about it shortly. The chapters, the author of Bosnia and Herzegovina chapter also find out that actually civil society organizations, having acknowledged the positive role of religious figures in fostering resilience in those communities, hence cooperating with them in such efforts, they acknowledge, those civil society organizations acknowledge, or they feel some kind of dissatisfaction with the effectiveness of these state religious institutions in actually building resilience. They ended up the chapter arguing that understanding how religion, politics, and ethnicity interact is actually crucial in addressing violent extremism and strengthening community resilience in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In the case of Lebanon, Marie's chapter emphasized, again, this intertwined relationship between the state and religion, religious institutions in general. But the chapter again retrieves the fact that, religious institutions, formal or informal, play a significant role in conflict de-escalations, at least according to her, during violent confrontations, so armed violent confrontation. Focusing on the Sunni and the Christian communities only, Marie argued that violent extremism is actually, in Lebanon, is actually a result of the sectarian-based political system, somehow related to what Maja was saying of the role of the state in actually fostering violence. In a way, Marie argues that violent extremism is actually sectarian, where affiliation to ethnicity or a religious group intertwined with politics through consociation in Lebanon, or consociation settings in Lebanon, somehow legitimizes violence. She made an explicit distinction between the formal and the informal institution and found that actually the informal religious institutions have much bigger influence on communities, both in fostering violence and building resilience. And although they lack the Weberian legitimacy of the state, without mentioning the Weberian words in a sense, but this is my reading at least to the chapter, those non-state-led or those informal religious institutions actually enjoy other sources of legitimacy, that basically the charisma of the religious figures, but also the traditional forces. She somehow makes a Foucaultian approach to which emphasizes basically that power exists everywhere, right? It exists in the speech. And she argues that hate speech in the chapter construct violence. She draws a fantastic analysis on how the relationship between the formal and the informal religious institutions and figures, bringing the rule of Dar al-Fatwa and the Lebanese League of Muslim Scholars. Those are the formal bodies, with the non-formal, the relationship between those formal bodies and the non-formal bodies groups and individuals such as Jama'a al-Islamiyya and individual figures such as Sheikh Adnan, Umama and Hassan Qutb and others. The recommendations that she came up with basically is the fact that we need to grant those religious institutions, the state religious institutions, since the non-state religious institutions have much bigger influence, the state religious institutions have to be have to gain more autonomy from the states, which encourages democratic processes, right? And strengthen basically their role in enhancing community resilience. Finally, in the Tunisian chapter, the study was conducted in mainly this marginalized two regions in the northwest and midwest of Tunis. And basically, the idea was to show how religiosity in the country was actually shaped by global and regional dynamics right after the Arab uprising in 2011. The chapter looks at violent extremism as a multi-phased phenomenon, and as a result of a range of factors that actually can vary from a context to another, even within one country. They concluded, of course, the factors that lead to violent extremism include institutional dysfunction. Again, goes back to what Maja was saying of, why the state matters here, and the idea that actually those states in the Middle East and North Africa remain largely post-colonial states where the state, where the processes of state formations are still ongoing. So for them, the institutional dysfunction of the state and the marginalization, or what they call it hugra, which is moral injustice, which kind of, at least in my reading, somehow draws a Marxist analysis of class clash between the bourgeois in the north and the northeast of the country, in the Sahel region, and in the middle and in the west of the country, which basically represent the working class communities. For instance, in El Kaif, they found out, El Kaif's town, that marginalization and social injustice drove vulnerability, while in Qayrawan, the neglect of religious symbolism contributed to radical religiosity in their terms. In Sidi Bouzid, the lack of cultural heritage makes the community actually vulnerable to radicalization. The study suggests that radicalization is primarily a response to social and political injustices, and varies, the intensity of violent extremism varies from a context to another. In general, to recap all this, the three chapters, basically the message that they conclude is that religious leader institutions, formal or informal, have an influence on societies, especially where religion is essential. And this is the case in the Balkan and in West Asia, North Africa, or the Middle East, and North Africa. The three chapters somehow acknowledge that while that religion plays a role in de-escalation of conflict, but it can also contribute to violence in one way or another. Especially if those religious institutions are seen, or they see themselves as part of an unfair political system, they might lose trust in the political settings or political institution, which basically allow for foreign influences on those religious figures, given that Islam in particular has no borders. So, and we've seen this issue happening in the case of Lebanon, where the Iranian presence is actually evident. I think the chapter also acknowledged that the debate on the autonomy of religion and politics remains a complicated issue and can cause further complexities. And I think I'll stop here. I don't know if you want me to add more. In the case of Iraq, I'm very happy to address them in the Q&A, but the mere fact that this process of religion and state they so overlap makes it really complicated to come up with a roadmap to how tackle violent extremism in religious based or religious in societies where religion is really influential. I think I'll stop here and I'll leave the rest of the Q&A. Thank you, Julie.
Great, thank you very much, Amjed. Yes, unfortunately, we're running out of time a little bit for this part, but we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. And again, I think it shows how complex and nuanced those dynamics are, and I guess that in the book we really try to explore all those complexities and nuances, as opposed to trying to make everything look very simple. All right, we're gonna move to the next and the last part of the book, and I am going to invite Johanna on the virtual stage. And Johanna, I know that you have not specifically edited this section, but I have to say that the work of Johanna might not be as visible as ours, and it's very unfair in a way. It doesn't reflect how crucial a role she played really into basically driving this project to a close, really, together with Vero. So we probably would be able to present the sections that we reviewed independently, but Johanna will actually be able, I'm sure with no problem, to present the whole book. And she became a real expert on those topics, I guess. Okay, so Johanna, I will give you also about 10 minutes to tell us about the civil society actors and their role in preventing or fostering violent extremism. Do you have any slides?
Thank you, Juline. No, I don't have any slides, so I would just opt with staying with this slide that's currently being shown, if that's okay. Okay, so I hope that you can hear me well. Great. Thanks so much. As Juline already indicated in the beginning, unfortunately, our great colleague Marie Kartam can't be here with us today, who actually coordinated this section on civil society actors and also contributed overall 2 chapters to the book. So you can imagine what an important part of our team she is. But yeah, of course, I can't replace her here to present the findings, but I will do my best to do it justice. So maybe to start, regarding the section on civil society actors, to give you an overview of the definition of civil society that we used, because we applied a very broad definition of civil society, including formal and informal structures that engage in public life, seeking to advance shared values and objectives. And these actors operate as basically as intermediary that lies outside the family, the market, and the states. And civil society actors include individuals such as, for example, community leaders, but also organizations, non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, but also online groups and social media communities, which is actually a very important or relevant group of civil society that comes up in the chapter on Kosovo in this section, that is as well captured under the umbrella of this definition. But also labor unions, professional associations, charitable and philanthropic foundations, academic and research institutions. So yeah, you can really see we really expanded to a broad range of actors when we talk about civil society. These institutions and groupings become active between individuals and the state, and often get into a position, yeah, as I said, as intermediary through partnerships, but also counterpowering other sources of power, which came along quite clearly throughout the chapters. And among one of the constituent elements is also the element of autonomy that's considered essential when we speak of civil society. In the 3 chapters of this section, we focus mainly on the interactions between government and civil society actors in the context, of course, of preventing and countering violent extremism. And this interaction involves horizontal coordination among government actors and public institutions, such as the police or security forces, ministries, different ministries, such as the ministries of health, of justice, or education, and social services on the one hand, and also vertical coordination between governmental institutions and civil society organizations on the other hand. And in the 3 chapters of the book that you also, you see the titles on the slide that is shown, the 3 case studies that are covered explicitly are Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Lebanon. But of course, also throughout the other chapters of the book and also the other countries that we looked into deeper, the civil society actors came up, but these are just 3 that specifically focus on these. So one of the key findings that kind of confirms the overall hypothesis, so to say, of our approach portrayed in this book is that civil society can fuel as well as tame violent extremism and the discourses that are connected with it. So it really speaks to our 2 sides of the same coin observation that is inherent in basically all of the actor types that we investigated in this volume, as you also already heard through the previous presentations. And maybe dive a bit deeper, or I will dive a bit deeper into some examples on the vulnerability side. So how civil society actors contribute to vulnerability to violent extremism. We found, for example, that unregulated online media environments that really allow unverified content, including hate speech, to flow freely through social media and the internet more broadly, manifests a key vulnerability factor. And on the opposite side, on the resilience side, it is shown that civil society, although it's not equally developed across the different regions that we look at, so the MENA region and the Western Balkans, due to financial, cultural, institutional, and political factors, civil society leaders in all of these contexts can play important horizontal and vertical bridging and mediating roles for social bonding within communities, but also across communities, and also building bridges across state-society relations. Especially in the Western Balkans, here civil society actors have been very prominent in prevention work, much more than governments or state actors in these contexts, since they have primarily focused on rather hard security measures to address violent extremism through policing or prosecution of violent extremism-related offenses. And in addition, the majority of the studied countries across the MENA region and the Western Balkans, just portray also a vast range of civil society actors. So basically all of the different types of civil society or different institutions, organizations that manifest civil society in our definition are to be found in the research findings. So I think another aspect that should be highlighted is that the research has also shown that women especially play a vital role in the resilience, fostering community resilience or prevention and countering violent extremism through their engagement in social organizations and NGOs, which in some of the case studies really shows that women are the most relevant or more often engaged in these kinds of organizations than men. But still, in all case studies, women are underrepresented in leadership positions in these organizations. In addition, even if initiatives are not explicitly labeled or conceived as preventing and countering violent extremism programs, civil society-led efforts, for example, like social clubs, especially for youth, also artistic projects, religious festivals, can contribute to the prevention of extremist narratives and behaviors and enhance social cohesion. And this happens through providing especially disenfranchised youth with a renewed sense of agency, positive identity markers, and the possibility for civic engagement and being part of a community. And one other aspect is that we may even argue that youth-led protests, so non-violent protests against socioeconomic injustices and marginalization or corruption, as we have seen in Tunisia in 2011, or also in Lebanon and Iraq in 2019, can even contribute to building community resilience, as these can serve as a constructive alternative to the attraction of extremist groups. So yeah, to close, maybe just quickly with two policy implications that we kind of concluded, or that were concluded in the chapters based on these findings, is that because of the important role of civil society actors in PCVE, or preventing and countering violent extremism, all of these, like also state designed and led initiatives, should include civil society as agents of resilience, and especially locally led programs that are aimed to empower youth, women, and marginalized groups, because civil society is often better placed to reach marginalized communities than formal state institutions. And maybe, however, this is the case, and similarly to other, for example, also religious leaders, civil society organizations that receive foreign funding can also be perceived as kind of detached from local realities or also national priorities. So yes, this also needs to be taken into account, and programs should seek to strengthen multi-stakeholder platforms that retain a locally rooted and led approach to resilience building. I think I will leave it here. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so very much, Johanna. You did very well, and I'm sure Marie would be extremely proud. So you did represent her very well. All right. So I think this is pretty much the overview we wanted to provide you of the book and all those fantastic chapters. And now I would like to ask every one of you, so the four co-editors we have with us today, maybe to think of one or two lesson learned or recommendation you would like to share with the audience today, very shortly, right? Because I really want to leave enough time for questions and answers, although we're doing really, really well. So thank you to all for sticking to the time. And while you're thinking of what you would like to say, I actually have this one final slide. So on the top left, you can see the very first picture we took for this project. The picture was taken in Berlin, in Berghof, really. And then at the bottom right, this is the very last picture we took just a few months ago. That was in Brussels, when we presented all the results and the recommendations for this research to European partners. And yes, I have to echo Amjed's words when I said that it was great to spend those 3 years to become pavers, as we call ourselves, I guess. it was indeed a fantastic group. And of course, I mean, how not to like meeting all across the world to speak about violent extremism and resilience, right? What's not to like? All right. So if you want to share your key lesson learned, your key recommendation, no specific order, although we can also follow the order of the presentation. Please, who wants to start? Yes, Maja, thank you.
As a P2 leader of theory, maybe I should start. I'll be very, very, very brief. Two things. We needed a new model of understanding of vulnerability and resilience in both regions, and we have provided that. So I think PAVE has paved that way very successfully. And that new model includes understanding the burden of legacy of violence that exists in both regions. Secondly, state and extremist movements and discourses are very complexly intertwined, and they operate differently in different contexts, but they are operating on a collective level in all regions. So this would be my takeaway.
Great, thank you, Maja. And by the way, I forgot to say that obviously not everyone is on the pictures, right? We were many more people to contribute to this research. All right, somebody would like to take the floor.
Yes, I can jump in, maybe with a couple of thoughts. So the first one, because I see you had also put that in the announcement for the event, kind of what do you mean by vulnerability and resilience being two sides of the same coin? I mean, I think in very simple terms, what we found was that every single actor that we have looked at in the book can play positive or negative roles, and so we couldn't really point at, okay, PCV community should work with those actors and not with those, because they can all play very ambivalent roles. So I mean, like for instance, taking the role of educational institutions, I think across many chapters we see how on the one hand segregated education is a major factor of vulnerability, but teachers throughout and even in those systems, I guess, they can still play very important roles in building critical thinking and other tools that I think equips individual students and communities with the means to resist this appeal and this lure of violent extremism. What we also found in the context of, for instance, of Serbia was how there's also temporal dimensions, or some actions in the short term might be useful. So the state kind of trying to co-opt radical actors, and that can play a positive role, but then in long term that's also kind of institutionally dangerous and so forth. So that's kind of what we try to evoke with that kind of phrasing. And then on the other hand, I also wanted to maybe emphasize that what we found throughout all of the countries that we looked at, and I think it needs to be reminded that even under the most extreme conditions and in fertile grounds, as to say, most communities are resilient and remain unaffected by the violent extremism. I would say violent extremism still is the exception rather than the rule. And when we looked at patterns, we felt that it's important to look at all drivers and forms of violent extremism. And so there's some tendencies, for instance, by governments and also outside actors to maybe look at, for instance, Islam as a source of extremism and then neglect far right and other types of extremisms. And so they should pay equal attention to those. And ultimately, ideology and religion are not necessarily the problem. The problem is very much about behavior. And I think that's where those policies should focus, is on tackling violent behavior. I'll stop it here.
Yeah, wow. Wow, I won't say anything else. Amjed, you're raising your hands.
Yes, just to, on top of what has already been said, one of the things that actually really struck me while I was working on this project and writing this coded volume is that while violent extremism, as controversial as it is, explaining it, analyzing it, as controversial as it is, it turns out to be, at least to me, much, much easier than come up with preventive violent extremism measures. in those regions that we come up with. Really, the issue that, you know, for example, just to give you an example, we whether explicitly or not, the chapters on Lebanon and in Serbia, Lebanon and Bosnia and Herzegovina, sorry, explicitly or implicitly call for separation of religion and politics, basically as a way to strengthen community resilience. While at the same time, the chapter on Serbia in the state section and the chapter on Tunisia explicitly or implicitly asked or called for a controlled state, controlled religious institution in a way, as a way to prevent violent extremism in the future. And I was thinking to myself, is there a third way? And then you go to the case of Iraq, and you will see that actually, in the case of Iraq, it is independent religious institution, marja'iyya, but in a way they still contribute to violent extremism or de-escalate violent extremism. So basically, the lessons that I can draw here is that, you know, when we come up with preventive violent extremism measure, the issue is really, really complicated and is sensitive. And it might differ not from a city to another, but it might differ actually from a village to another. And this is something that those who work on the ground should really take this into account. You know, I don't think I can come up with a roadmap, even if a general one, of preventive violent extremism in Iraq. I think this is impossible. I think it's the drivers of violent extremism and prospect of preventive violent extremism might differ from a village to another, even though that they geographically may be a road or a 10-kilometer separate them. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite interesting because it does echo dynamics of localization and fragmentation that we're very much looking at here at PeaceRef. So a lot of synergies already. Yes, Johanna, please.
Thank you very much. And I hope that what I am planning to say now does not come across as contradicting the very nuanced and localized kind of dynamics that often, you know, condition the development of extremist structures and narratives and also resilience. But I think what I found particularly helpful to sort my thoughts about it, and what already Maja alluded to as well, is that we kind of came up with an approach to understand violent extremism not as or also radicalization not as a like an isolated phenomenon, but really as part of a cycle of conflict steps, so to say, that are determined by the legacies of violence, that are determined by polarization, dynamics within society, and radicalization, and then conflict, and then failed reconciliation, that all kind of feed into each other. And so yeah, the radicalization and violent extremism part is really very much interrelated with this, and it's part of this conflict cycle. And I think that also personally, yeah, just also helps me to understand sometimes what is going on in the world, you know, especially nowadays. And I think that's the main takeaway that I would have on a theoretical side.
Great, and that's a really good one. I don't think it contradicts what has been said earlier. All right, so we did actually pretty well time-wise, which means that we have almost half an hour for questions, for answers, for discussions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think that we're going to stop recording also.